ألف لام ميم الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم نزل عليك الكتاب بالحق مصدقا لما بين يديه.
Assalamu Alaikum Warahmatullahi. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Brother Ali, we are really very grateful with this beautiful recitation. While I would like to have a pleasure of introducing our speaker for tonight in the person of Sheikh Abdullah Al-Andalusi, who is a rebel to Islam, and he is really having an in-depth Islamic knowledge at the age of 18. From there, he's really popularly really have an outstanding lectures in various universities and colleges, engage in very encouraging, very motivational Islamic debates with a lot of Christians. Popular debates of whom is the one he had with Dr. James, an American artist. Now, without wasting much of your time, ladies and gentlemen, the speaker is here today to talk to us about the topic, is Islam synonymous to terrorism?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for running ISOC, for inviting me today to talk about this interesting and somewhat controversial topic on whether Islam is synonymous with terrorism. I would refer to myself as just simply a da'i. I'm not a sheikh or Islamic scholar. I'm just someone that tries to present Islam, and we all present Islam to people that we know, and even also to ourselves as well. So inshallah we are all da'is. I think I'll start off with the definition of terrorism, which is I think that's probably even more controversial than the topic, because people don't know how you define terrorism. If you plant your flag in one definition, then it negates a lot of the definitions which some governments want it to mean. And if you make it more broad, it also includes governments. So there's a bit of a problem with the definition of terrorism. But I will, since we're speaking in English language, I will go to the English dictionary to define terrorism. And there's basically three meanings that come within this English dictionary. One of them is the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce, especially for political purposes. The second meaning, a state of fear and submission produced by terrorism or terrorization. And the third, which is actually the classical original meaning, which is a terroristic method of governing or resisting government. So basically terrorism, actually the term became more widely known during the French Revolution, where the idea of ruling people by inflicting terror into their hearts, or basically terrorizing or making them fearful of the government, was a means of gaining control, and it was codified into the term terrorism. Obviously it's somewhat expanded since that time. Okay, so that's the definition of terrorism. What about the definition of Islam? Well, the meaning of Islam, there's two meanings that people generally try to see the root etymology of. One of them is Islam, which means submission, or basically submission to God, is the meaning that a lot of people ascribe to Islam. Other people say that it originates from the root word salam, peace. I would like to take both those options, that there is peace through the submission to God. And I think that these two meanings are not mutually exclusive. Now, just taking this understanding of submitting to God and peace, already we see that terrorism is not a synonym for Islam. And what the word synonym means is basically that you can use another word instead of that. So if I say delicious or tasty, that might be synonymous. So I say something is delicious. In this university you study food technology, so that was more appropriate. So something delicious, those sandwiches in the back are delicious, and those sandwiches are tasty, is synonymous. But obviously already just by looking at the definition of the words, these terms are not synonymous. But of course people don't mean that. What they mean is that they generally equate terrorism with Islam, because although even the most ardent Islamophobe will say that not all Muslims are terrorists, they will say that all terrorists or most terrorists are Muslim. So I'm not going to obfuscate or spin a nice, wonderful lecture where I'm going to just talk about the facts, because of these facts, no one can lie about, and no one can mislead. So let's look at the facts. So are most terrorists Muslim? Then I think is the question we're going to pose to ourselves. So let's look at terrorist attacks that happen in the US. Well, firstly, in terms of crime rates amongst the different religious communities, the Muslims actually have the lowest crime rate of any religious community in the United States. Now, considering in the United States it has one of the highest homicide rates for guns and so on and so forth, you can tell that actually, I don't think really the American, I mean, more people die, tens of thousands of people die of gun crime every year in America. If there was something to be worried about, it wouldn't be terrorism, it would be actually use of guns, or more, probably more to the point, Americans are willing to use guns on their fellow citizens. And most of those people are certainly not Muslim. But let's look at the statistics. According to a 2005 FBI official report of all terrorist attacks committed in the US soil from the year 1980 to 2005. That's quite a length of time, certainly 25 years. Only 6% of terrorist attacks were committed by Muslims. 7% of the attacks were committed by what is defined as Jewish extremists or Zionists. Christian and secular extreme left-wing groups account for 40% of terrorist attacks in America. We're talking about blowing up abortion clinics. We're talking about people going into, I don't know if they don't really count Christian fundamentalists who go into a gay nightclub with shotguns and start shooting the people who go to a gay nightclub. They don't count that as a terrorist attack, even though they said they did it because the Bible said it's forbidden. Whereas if a Muslim did that, terrorist attack, of course. But I don't think it counts that, but it certainly counts bombs. And obviously the Oklahoma bombing was a left-wing guy who did that, who blew up a government building, killing over 100 people. And of course, the biggest group that commits terrorism is Puerto Rican nationalists. Because Puerto Rico is, although it's kind of part of the United States, the Puerto Ricans don't want to be part of the United States. And obviously, since their politicians have failed them, a lot of them have felt the need to engage in terrorism, and they actually are the majority group who commit terrorism in the US. Okay, maybe that's the US. What about Europe? Let's have a look at Europe. According to Europol, the European Police Office, in 2006, there were 498 incidents in 11 EU countries which were labelled as terrorist attacks. The Basque separatist group ETA committed most of those, but Muslims only carried out one attack in 2006 out of the 498 terrorist attacks that occurred in 2006. When looking at data from 2007 and 2008, we see that 0.4% of terrorist attacks in the European Union were committed by Muslims, which is basically less than 1%. It's actually half of 1%. And with the new data we have from Europol for 2009 and 2010, it shows that only 0.7% of terrorist attacks over those years were done by Muslims. Basically about 4 attacks out of 543 terrorist attacks. Now, obviously we see that in Europe, most of the attacks are committed by separatist groups. They're committed by far-right nationalists. I mean, we all know Anders Breivik and his attacks. Now, according to these statistics, which is the majority? Are Muslims the majority of terrorists? Are they the ones which are spearheading terrorism in Europe and the United States? No. And of course, some people might say, but you see, if you look at, we count terrorist attacks as insurgent attacks in Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia and now Mali and so on. So we also count this as terrorist attacks. Well, okay, fine. You invade a country and then you have an insurgency against you and you count it as terrorist attacks. If we're going to play this game, then I could count every single military operation which an army does. An army on a day-to-day basis does hundreds or even thousands of military operations. They call it sorties sometimes, or operations or missions. And I could call that terrorist attacks too. And if you want to go by that standard, the United States Army has done more terrorist attacks in Iraq and in Afghanistan than any of the insurgents have combined. So you don't win on those points either. So the majority of people who commit terrorist attacks are not Muslims. What about suicide bombers? They say, but you see, although you have terrorist attacks around the world, it's not as bad as Muslims because Muslims commit suicide bombing. Well, obviously the first question that comes to mind is, so it's morally better for you to have a bomb with a timer as opposed to a bomb that you detonate yourself. Okay, I see the difference there. But no, there's no difference between a bomb or whichever triggering mechanism you have. At least with the one who commits suicide bombing, he dies, whereas upon the timer, the bomber lives to bomb again. So that's actually even worse if you want to think a bit like that. But that's not the argument. If you want to look at who actually invented suicide bombing, if we want to put aside Japanese army during World War II, we'll go to the Tamil Tigers, who were the pioneers of suicide bombing, and they are Hindu. They don't do it in the name of Hinduism, they do it in the name of Tamil nationalism, but Buddhist shrines have been bombed by the Tamil Tigers, and so they have included a religious element into their campaigns. And according to Jain Securities, between 1980 and 2000, Tamil Tigers committed a total of 168 suicide attacks on civilians and military targets. The number of suicide attacks easily exceeded the combined total of those attributed to Hezbollah and Hamas during the same period. So combined, Hezbollah and Hamas, they actually beat them. So Tamil Tigers actually beat them, but no one says that is Hinduism synonymous with terrorism. Of course they don't. So I would say that Muslims are not unique in having a small fringe of people who engage in terrorism. And out of those who do engage in terrorism around the world, Muslims are still a minority. They are a fringe of a fringe who basically engage in terrorism. So I think the idea or the belief that Muslims only form a minority of those people who commit, so a majority of those people who commit terrorism is untrue. What about the reasons for terrorism? Well, the narrative is that Islam calls for war against the West because the West is it's licentious, they believe in freedom and democracy, and somehow Muslims just woke up one day and said, you know what, we hate how people are living across the world and we're going to attack them because we don't like how they live. Is this true? Now obviously the Islamophobes and politicians and government would like you to believe this, and I'll get to the reasons why towards the end of my lecture. But we see that Michael Schur, who is the former chief of the Bin Laden unit from 1996 to 1999, and he was a part of the counter-terrorist center of the CIA, basically. So this guy was a chief of the CIA in charge of the Bin Laden unit. And of course, even after September 11th, he was a special advisor to the chief of the Bin Laden unit. So after he basically retired from that, he was a special advisor to the Bin Laden unit. So he continued to work with the CIA into the war on terror era. Here's what he says about the motivation of Bin Laden. His motive is to change our policies. He really doesn't give a damn about our democracy or our society. He's after a change in our policies which he views as lethal to Muslims. So the reason that this person believes, who works in the CIA as a chief of the Bin Laden unit in the CIA, the reason that Bin Laden wants to go after the West or wants to attack targets in the West is because he views the policies of the West as being lethal to Muslims and he wants to change it. Nothing about Islam or some clash of religions or beliefs there. We see Bill Christensen, again another former director of CIA's Office of Regional and Political Analysis. He himself said, and he quoted the Attorney General of the United States, who he believes uttered a misstatement, an incorrect statement, but he quotes him, and this is what he said. He quoted Ashcroft, who said, "We are impelled to do so today by the inescapable fact of September the 11th, a day that reminded us in no uncertain terms that we have enemies in the world and that these enemies seek to destroy us. We on September 11th discovered that our way of life is not immune from attack and even from destruction." Now, this is what Bill Christensen, now in his own words, remarks about this. He says, "The guts of what Ashcroft said is," and I quote again, when he said, "We have enemies in this world that seek to destroy us. I submit to you that this is simply not a true statement." So Bill Christensen says that the Attorney General has issued an untrue statement, and he continues, "The evidence I've seen shows that the real objective of Muslim extremists led by Osama bin Laden was to rid the Muslim world, of American domination and influence. They wanted not to destroy the United States, rather they wanted the United States out of their land." So these people are not Muslims. They're not apologists for Islam, and they're certainly not sheikhs or scholars or anything which they're not biased in that sense. They worked in the CIA and they studied and they dealt with the issue of Osama bin Laden, and they themselves have said that Osama bin Laden's motivation has nothing to do with Western society, how they live, or their ideology or their way of life. Now I mentioned that I will up the ante and I will now quote Osama bin Laden himself. What did Osama bin Laden himself say about this discussion? Firstly, I think the issue about terrorism is why people hate terrorism, why it should be abhorred, is because terrorism involves the killing of innocent civilians. And so the argument that Islam condones terrorism is because they believe that Islam condones killing innocent civilians. However, Osama bin Laden doesn't agree with that. And that sounds shocking. He actually doesn't agree with that. Now, in an interview with someone who actually interviewed him and asked him that someone said to him, basically, what do you say regarding the issue of killing civilians, and what does Islam say about this? And so he says, Osama says, they say that the killing of innocents is wrong and invalid, and for proof they say that the Prophet Muhammad forbade the killing of children and women, and that is true. It is valid and has been laid down by the Prophet in an authentic tradition, or hadith. So this is, Osama bin Laden is saying this. Then the interviewer is saying, this is precisely what I'm talking about. This is exactly why I'm asking you about this. And then Osama bin Laden, as an afterthought, said, but this forbidding of killing children and innocents is not set in stone, he says. It's not set in stone. And he basically says, if the disbelievers were to kill our children and women, then we should not feel shame to do the same to them, mainly to deter them from trying to kill our children and women again. And then he continues, those who kill our women and our innocents, we will kill their women and innocents until they stop doing so. So firstly, the first point is that Osama bin Laden is not viewing this as a war against Islam versus the West, in that we want to compel America to become Muslim, we want to take over America or take over Britain and destroy the West and so on. None of that. His first and foremost reason is that he wants to stop innocent Muslims from being killed by military aggression, by invasion and so on. That's his reason. Nothing to do with Islam. And when he's asked about this, and he affirms that yes, the Prophet Muhammad, he believes that the Prophet Muhammad forbade the killing of women and children, of course, and by implication, innocents. However, his response, his self-justification, his own head, is basically that, well, they kill our women and children, so we have to retaliate and almost to teach them not to, what it feels like, so they stop doing it to us. This is what he's trying to argue. Now, Islam doesn't allow that, because just because your enemy is using something which is wrong, doesn't mean that gives you the right to do something wrong against them. As Muslims, we should be better than our enemies and better than those who attack us. But again, I'll get to the evidence regarding that now. So this is what Osama bin Laden said. This is what the CIA former directors have said. What does the Islamic text say? What does the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad and the Qur'an say? Well, there is a verse which is cited by all the Islamic scholars to discuss about not killing civilians in war. And this verse says, fight in the cause of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress, for Allah loves not the transgressors. So fight those who fight you. I mean, this is a refutation of Osama bin Laden. Yeah, right, fight those who fight you, but do not transgress. Now, if you think that you can kill women and children, then what is there left for you to transgress? There's nothing left to transgress. So obviously, if an Islamophobe who really wants Islamophobes generally want Islam to want to kill innocents because it vindicates their agendas, which I'll get to later. But how can they explain that when the Quran says do not transgress? So what is there left to transgress if you believe that everyone can be killed, anything can be done in war? What is there left to transgress? If you believe there is limitations, and I'll get to the more elucidation of this, then the Quran is refuting people who say that, well, they kill our civilians, so we have to kill their civilians. The Quran says, do not transgress. And again, another surah of the Quran says, nor slay such life as God has made sacred, except in just cause. And then it goes, and nor commit fornication, and any that does this only meets punishment, and the penalty on the day of judgment will be doubled for them, and he will dwell therein in ignominy. So the Quran is condemning those who slay life that Allah has made sacred, and Allah has made human life sacred, not only Muslim life sacred. of course, there is surahs in the Qur'an which talks about how we deal with people in war and people who fight us. And it said, for example, Allah forbid you not, with regards to those who fight you not for your belief, nor drive you out of your homes, from dealing kindly and justly with them, for Allah loves those who are just. If Islam is about conquering the world by force and massacring people and killing disbelievers, then why would it say this verse? For it says that Allah does not forbid you from dealing kindly. Kindly with who? Kindly with people who are not Muslim, basically. Allah does not forbid you from dealing kindly and justly with them, because Allah loves the just. Again, we see in the Quran, therefore, if they leave you alone and refrain from fighting you, offer you peace, then God gives you no excuse for fighting them. So this is what the surah is saying, that if they leave you alone and refrain from fighting you and offer you peace, referring to those who the Muslims are dealing with, then Allah gives you no excuse to fight them. And again, we see that actually as Muslims, we should also try to foster love and friendship. So it says in another surah of the Quran, in ayat, it may be that God will grant love and friendship between you and those whom you hold as enemies, for Allah has power over all things. For those you hold as enemies, it may be that Allah will actually then make them into friends. So in terms of friendship and love. So this is what the Quran is saying, dealing with people who fight you, people who stop fighting you, and people who seek peace from you, that Allah does not give you an excuse to fight them. And it says it quite explicitly. Now then, what is the basis for Muslims fighting in Islam? I was very, very brief on this. And the basis for Muslims fighting in Islam is in essence fighting that Allah's word is the highest. What we mean by this is that we mean that firstly, we are witnesses to mankind, so basically we establish justice, we establish as examples the monotheism and the worship of the one God, and we establish as an example to all mankind the submission to the one God. But the reasons that we actually go to war is if we see people being oppressed. And this is because in Islam we view oppression as worse than murder, as it says in Surah Baqarah, ayah 191, that basically oppression is worse than murder, or fitna is worse than basically killing. Is that the word fitna means oppression, it means a whole number of other things, but generally oppression is one of the meanings that it conveys. It's very rich. The Arabic in the Quran is very rich, subhanallah. And we also see the Quran telling the Muslims who are kind of almost hesitant to fight for the weak in the world and the people who are oppressed. It says, and what is wrong with you that you fight not in the cause of God for the weak and oppressed amongst the men, women and children who say, our Lord, rescue us from this town, whose people are oppressors, and give us from you a protector, and give us from you a helper. It didn't say, and why don't you fight in the cause of God for the Muslims who are weak and oppressed in the world. No, the ayah is it's general. It's to anyone who is weak and oppressed, amongst the men, women and children. And again, the Quran says, and fight them until persecution is no more, and belief is for God. And if they desist, then let there be no hostility except against the wrongdoers. So if you fight them against them until the persecution ends. But if they stop their persecution, then there should be no hostility between you except against wrongdoers, and it usually refers to criminals. So maybe, obviously, within a country or nation, you have people who are criminals who might do bad things, they might cross over the border. These people you can still punish because obviously they're criminals and they engage in cross-border activities like drug smugglers and so on and so forth, and mafia and so on. So we see that this is the reasons that Islam moves people to fight. Actually, it's to fight against oppression and injustice. And so on, and this is why Muslims go into fight, and we can't just fight people who want to be peaceful to Muslims, but we have to respect them. So I'll give you an example. People might say, "Oh, give me an example," because if you see early Islam, the Muslims spread throughout all different nations and countries, and it seems convenient that you say that all these leaders, the Byzantine Emperor, the Persian Emperor, and the Coptic leader were all kind of oppressors. Well, certainly they were under a feudal system, and the Persian emperor was under kind of a theocratic feudal system. But I give the example of Abyssinia. Abyssinia, there was no fighting between Muslims and Abyssinians for 1,000 years. And why do I stop it at 1,000? It was only because some Abyssinians converted to Islam and wanted to establish an Islamic state within Abyssinia. Look, it's not our fault if people want to convert from that people and they want to establish Islam. That's like an internal matter. but Abyssinia was not conquered by the Muslims, even though they were right next to the heartlands of Islam. Abyssinia was never conquered or invaded by Muslims. We see now, obviously, we see from the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that we see that, for example, one narration is the companion narrated that during one of the battles, the Prophet found a woman who was killed. So on the battlefield, one of the bodies, one of them was actually a woman, and he basically, at that moment, he told the Muslims, he impressed upon them, he disapproved of this, and he said, and he forbade it. He made it explicitly clear that you can't kill women and children. And very important. And then we also see Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was his right-hand man. Abu Bakr and then became Khalifa, he became the leader of the Muslims. And Abu Bakr, expressing the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, he advised the Muslim soldiers, I advise you 10 things. Do not kill women or children or the aged or the infirm person. Do not cut down fruit-bearing trees. Do not destroy inhabited places. Do not slaughter sheep or camels except for food. Do not even burn bees and do not scatter them. Do not steal from the booty and do not be cowardly. I mean, do not even kill bees, for example. And they state that we can kill humans or non-Muslims. This is not the case. So we see that these are the narrations, these are the surahs which made it very explicit, and that's only one narration. There's actually quite a lot of hadith, there's so much narrations of Prophet Muhammad continually and repetitively forbidding the killing of women and children, and many Sahabas talking about not even killing people who are who basically are not participating in the battle, might even be around the battle but not participating in it. Others say that also males are not protected, or males who are farmers who are not engaged in warfare. They're farmers, they're just non-combatants, and you don't touch them either. So there's so many narrations on this. It's impossible to deny. Now, okay, this is the narrations. Now, am I just putting a new interpretation on these narrations? Has anyone actually ever had the understanding which I'm saying to you today from the classical Islamic period? Well, all Islamic scholars, all the classical scholars have this, but I'm going to cite only a few because time is very limited. I'll quote one of the leaders of the Islamic state, the Caliphate, Caliph Umar Abdulaziz, who was the leader of the Muslims when during the height, Muslims reached a height for quite a long time, but he was during a height of the Islamic state where Muslims didn't have to pretend that or say anything about Islam to pretend to anyone else. They had no reason. They could be honest about their beliefs. No one can say, an Islamophobe can't say, oh, they were basically doing taqiyya, or they were lying about it. This is the Caliph himself, the Caliph of the Muslims, saying this, and here's what he said, citing the surah of the Qur'an. I quoted, "Fight the way of Allah against those who fight against you, and do not transgress the limits. Indeed, Allah loves not those who transgress." And here's what he says about it: the killing of women and children is included within this, and so are those who are not involved in warfare. So Caliph Umar Abdulaziz is commenting about that ayah of the Qur'an, which I quoted. Imam al-Qurtubi said, "The fact that someone disbelieves in Islam does not prevent us from being just to him, and that our dealing with him, even in a state of war, should only be restricted to fighting or capturing them if they deserve so. And it is not permissible for us to retaliate in the same manner, even if they kill our women and children and cause our sorrow to befall us. It is not permissible for us to act likewise with the intention of making them feel grief and sorrow." So I think Osama bin Laden should have been reading from the classical scholarship, because they clearly disagree with him. I will quote one which is frequently cited as a classical scholar, which militants use to justify their beliefs, Ibn Taymiyyah. And here's what Ibn Taymiyyah says. The foundation is that the blood of Bani Adam, which is basically all mankind, the tribe of Adam, is sanctified and inviolable, and no one is killed except with right. Killing due to kufr is not something which the legislations have agreed upon at any one time in the Sharia, such as killing the one who sits out of combat. For this is something that the legislations and intellect do not differ over. The blood of a disbeliever during the early history of Islam was sanctified and inviolable, and just like the original sanctity of a person, Allah prevented the Muslims from killing such a disbeliever. So here is what Ibn Taymiyyah is saying explicitly, and he cited a lot in the media and by Islamophobes as being the kind of intellectual grandfather of militancy within Islam, and this is what he's saying about the matter. People say, oh, but Muslims, if any Westerner goes to the Muslim world, they take him hostage. You see them, sometimes they take him hostage. Well, firstly, if that's the case, no one would go to Morocco or Tunisia or Egypt or so on and so forth. It's actually become a tourist industry there. They seem to forget all the biggest Muslim countries and only focus on some obscure and fringe elements, like somewhere in Mali or somewhere in Nigeria. But we see what the again, classical scholar Ibn Qudayma said about hostages. He didn't talk about hostages, he talked about how you treat non-Muslims. And he said that if a disbeliever, so someone who's not Muslim, enters Dar al-Islam, which is the lands of Islam, without having any covenant, so basically he comes from a land there is no peace treaty with Muslims, and he's carrying goods with him for sale in Islamic lands, and other merchants come with him without taking any covenant, we are not allowed to fight or expel them. So you're not allowed to kill them or fight them or even kick them out, because they are clearly just civilians. They're not warriors, they're not soldiers, they are merchants, and you don't kick them out. Okay, what about, and I would like to cite this, people say, okay, this is how you treat non-Muslims who come from an external country. What about non-Muslims who are living in the Muslim lands? How do you treat them? Because surely these are maybe Islam doesn't want you to treat non-Muslims who come from other lands in a bad way, because that might cause diplomatic incidents in classical Islam. So, but those under your power, you probably really oppress them and persecute them because they have no protectors, right? Well, then this again goes against the narration of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There are sources of the Qur'an which make general statements about this, but this is actually very specific, where the Prophet Muhammad mentioned it explicitly. And here's what he says: non-Muslims who live in Muslim lands are not religiously obliged members of the state. So they're not obliged to do jihad, they're not obliged to pay zakat, they don't come under religious regulation like a normal Muslim would under an Islamic state. The treatment, how an Islamic state deals with non-Muslim citizens is much like how a secular state deals with citizens. In essence, to non-Muslims, the Islamic state, it might as well be a secular state for them. And it has a concept called citizenship, which we call dhimma. Right? Because the meaning of dhimmi or dhimma is a person under covenant. And if anyone who studies political philosophy, the history of political philosophy, Jacques Rousseau, who was the French philosopher, he developed the idea of the contract citizen. In essence, we are all contract citizens of the state. So we make a contract with the state that the state will give us protection as long as we pay tax. That's basically the contract citizen. And this is what dhimmi means. Now, Islamophobes say, oh, dhimmi, it's a very evil term. But in the West, everyone is a dhimmi, according to the definition, the Islamic definition of the state. And in America and in all these Western countries, in any secular state, by definition, everyone is a dhimmi of the state. So it's not some kind of negative term, it just means that you're a contract citizen. Now, here's what the Prophet Muhammad said about the dhimmi, the non-Muslim who's a contract citizen of the state. He said, whoever harms a dhimmi, harms me. The Prophet Muhammad said this. Now, as you know, we as Muslims hate for anyone even to insult the Prophet Muhammad. We can't even think about someone hitting him. We can't even imagine someone actually attacking him or hurting him. You know, just insulting him is bad enough. But the Prophet Muhammad said, he kind of made it equal. He made it equal. If you harm a non-Muslim, you harm him. And for a Muslim, that is a very, very weighty and very grave prohibition. To actually harm a dhimmi is harming the Prophet Muhammad. And in another narration, he said, whoever oppresses a mu'ahid, which is it's a synonym for dhimmi, whoever oppresses a mu'ahid, or imposes upon him anything more than he can afford, or humiliates him, or takes anything from him without his consent, I will challenge him on the Day of Judgment. On the Day of Judgment in front of God, Prophet Muhammad will challenge the Muslim who oppresses the non-Muslim, who humiliates him. Like humiliation, I mean, in this country, it's not a crime to humiliate people. People humiliate each other all the time. But Muslims are prohibited from even humiliating non-Muslim citizens who live amongst Muslims. You're not allowed to humiliate them or make them feel bad. You can't do that. And otherwise, what is the punishment, so to speak? What is the penalty? The Prophet Muhammad will ask God to condemn you on the day. The Prophet Muhammad will ask God to condemn you on the Day of Judgment. I mean, think about that. For a Muslim, that's a very scary concept. I mean, I don't know if anyone's from different religions here, but if you're a Christian, it's like Jesus condemning you on the Day of Judgment, and so on. It is quite serious. And of course, I mean, not just that, not only that, but we see in the Qur'an, and to anyone who wants to check this out for yourself, Surah 6, Ayah 108, the Qur'an tells Muslims, do not insult the idols of basically the pagans. Do not insult the idols of the pagans that they set up besides God, lest they blaspheme and curse God out of ignorance. As Muslims, just generally speaking, not even whether we're in a Muslim society or non-Muslim society, we're not even, forget about terrorism, we're not even allowed to insult the religion or the beliefs of religions or ideas that we abhor. As Muslims, we're monotheistic. We're strictly monotheistic in terms of we're Unitarian and monotheist. And the most abhorrent concept to us theologically is polytheism. Right? The most abhorrent concept to us. But the Quran is telling us not to insult the gods or these other gods that the idolaters and polytheists and so on and so forth pray to. We're not allowed to, forget even bombing them, we're not allowed to insult their beliefs. And it's not for any other reason except that of the offence, they feel it. Obviously, it hurts their feelings. And obviously, the Quran's almost saying that you wouldn't really like it if they insulted you. So it's that kind of empathic, argument that you wouldn't like it if they did it to you. So, considering all this evidence, clearly Islam doesn't advocate killing women and children or non-combatants, and it actually urges respect and even protection. As Muslims, we're meant to protect non-Muslims around the world who are being oppressed and have no one to help them. So if, when Rwanda was happening, when the Tutsis were being butchered, it's actually a shame on us that we weren't there first helping to protect them. Obviously at this point in time, we're the ones being oppressed in our own countries, so we have to sort out our backyard first. But it's still a shame on us, because we should have been there to protect the Tutsis. It doesn't matter, Tutsis are not Muslim, it doesn't matter. The Quran says, what is wrong with you that you fight not in the cause of Allah for those who are oppressed on the earth. And it's a shame on us that we weren't there to protect the Tutsis. It's a shame on us that we weren't there to protect the Jews during World War II. Again, obviously, we were weak in our technology and our military, but still, it's still a shame, and it's a continuing shame that we're not here to protect the people who are being oppressed in this world today, be they Muslim or non-Muslim. So then, who are then the real terrorists? I would argue, it's basically the people who go around this world and think it is okay to start wars and initiate wars for resources, for oil, for gas, and so on, knowing full well that civilians will die because of that. Now, what the argument is that, well, yes, while the militaries might do that, they don't actively go and kill women and children or civilians. They don't actively do that, whereas terrorists, they actively do that. I say, well, you missed the point. If you go pursuing self-interest, not a just cause, if it's a humanitarian cause, I find, no, self-interest, knowing full well that civilians will die, then that is no different. And you consider it to be okay, you consider it to be acceptable, then you are no different to a terrorist. That is terrorism. Now, we see, for example, when Madeleine Albright was asked, she was the US ambassador to the United Nations, and she was asked on the program 60 Minutes, that basically the interviewer said, we have heard that 500,000 children have died. And I mean, that's more children have died in Hiroshima, obviously due to the Iraqi sanctions. Is that justified? What do you think about this? And she said that, and her response was, when they asked, is that price worth it? What was her response? I don't know if you've heard of it. We think that price is worth it, she said. We actually think 500,000 children died. We think that price is worth it. That price, the price for oil. And that's what she argued. On another point as well, if you want to look at who's killed the most people in the world, I mean, obviously I don't like this game because you kill one, it's like you kill the whole of humanity. But if you want to argue purely on that killing is wrong and people who kill the most must be the most wrong, which is what they argue in a lot of these Islamophobes argue, they still is problematic for the Western civilization as opposed to the Islamic one. And I'll give you an example. Based on a survey that was done on this, historical survey done at the University of Louisville, and said about this, it was called Body Count, a quantitative review of political violence across the world civilizations. And here's what they said. They found that 30.7% of the death tolls due to violence, war and oppression caused over the last 2,000 years was done by Western civilization. That's 30%. The remainder is 21% comes from communist and military secularist regimes. And out of all that, Muslims, the Islamic civilization only counts for 5.5% of the total estimated death toll of anything. And when they deduced that, they included all kinds of Muslims, including, like, for example, Timurlane, who was his policies were not really Islamic, but because he was a Muslim, they counted him as well. So even including all the bad Muslims, every bad Muslim and bad leader who's a Muslim, all these people, all the death toll of all the death tolls regarding people who were killed for violence, war, and oppression, out of all these people, only 5% was caused by Islam, whereas 30% was caused by the Western civilization. So by that calculus, the West civilization has killed 6 times more people than the Muslim civilization has, yet we are somehow immorally wrong and evil and so on, and an evil force in the world, and they are morally right in that sense. It's not correct. So they don't win on any of these points, and if you really investigate it, what you'll see is that they fulfill the criteria. Governments who use violence to secure political aims. Remember my definitions, I started 3 definitions. Violence to secure political aims related to resources and knowing civilians will die fits the definition 1 of terrorism according to the dictionary. We know that America uses torture, like Abu Ghraib and these black sites, CIA black sites to torture people in secret, and this creates an aura of fear amongst Muslims, amongst their enemies, and their politicians obviously have talked about how this is positive for American foreign policy to invoke fear in people who oppose America. This again is terrorism by the second definition of terrorism, and of course, when the American government uses this overblown and exaggerated threat of Islamic terrorism to scare people into following what the American government wants to do, including getting rid of a whole bunch of things from their constitution. They haven't got rid of it, but they've instituted new laws. Osama bin Laden, Obama, sorry, I get confused between the two. Obama instituted laws which effectively abrogate habeas corpus. The right to have a trial, the right to actually to know what you're charged with, the right to actually go to court. They can be a non-American citizen can be held indefinitely. He signed this. Obama, Mr. Change is coming. Yeah, change certainly came for the worse. This fills the third definition of terrorism, which is ruling a people via the use of fear. And so, by all those 3 definitions, it is the Western governments who participate in aggressive foreign policy, which fulfill these criteria. Now, I want to finish off by just saying that what are the agendas of the people who actually overblow Islamic terrorism and demonize Islam and indicate that or kind of put to Islam that Islam is the cause for terrorism, Islam is the cause for killing and massacres and things like that. This is, you get a number of factions. Obviously the government, one of the reasons that it is useful for them to kind of imply that a form of Islam is the cause of terrorism is because if terrorism happens, people want to know why it happens. And then either they tell the people, well, yes, because of our foreign policy, and sorry, it's blowback, so you have to pay for it. But that's tough. People won't accept that. People don't like that. They'll blame the governments, and the governments will be unpopular. So they have to say, no, it's not. It's not because of our foreign policy. It's because they just hate us. I don't know if you're in secondary school and so on, and let's say you hit a child, not a kid, maybe you hit someone, you slap someone, you insulted someone, for example, and then basically the kid in front of the teacher came up to you and hit you back, and all the teacher saw was the kid hitting you back, and the teacher asked, "Why did he hit you back? Did you do something?" Nah, this person's crazy. Yeah, that's the explanation the government feeds its people. In essence, that's really what it is. In essence, that they just hate us. Who to funk it? They hate us. So there is that reason. The other reason is that the governments they know that Islam is not conducive to Western foreign policy if it revives itself. So if Islam is revived and established with the implementation of Sharia, it will interdict their capitalist foreign policies. It will interdict their unfair and unjust economic practices around the world and their subjugation of Muslims and cheap resources. And they don't want to see that. They don't, obviously Islam believes in justice and fair trade, and they don't want to see that. And so in essence, having a revived, a renewed or re-established caliphate is the worst case scenario for the Western politicians. And just if you think that, is it really the fear of a caliphate that motivates them? Well, just basically discover for yourself what Bush has said about the caliphate, what Tony Blair said about the caliphate, or a number of English and American politicians have mentioned about the caliphate. Mainstream ones have said about the caliphate that the problem, that the fear they're worried about is a kind of re-established totalitarian state, which they call the caliphate, basically, which obviously is maligning what a caliphate actually is. It's not actually totalitarian. So they've said it themselves. And in order to interdict Islamic revivalism, they'll say that this is extremism, and extremism is a conveyor belt to violent terrorism, and so they both must be dealt with. And so to basically interdicting violent terrorism, it gives them an excuse to interdict quote-unquote extremists, who are, as anyone that believes that Islam has laws and has a political project, which would mean that the Prophet Muhammad, his Sahabas, and all the classical scholars were Islamists or extremists as well, by the same definition, which is just obviously absurd. In fact, there was a guy I knew, his grandfather was 103 years old, from Algeria, and he knew the Ottoman Caliphate, and he gave his bay'ah, he gave his pledge of allegiance to the Ottoman Caliphate. He actually lived long enough to remember them. And according to the kind of the political pundits and the commentators, if he just remained on that same belief, which was considered mainstream within Islam, mainstream even accepted in Europe that this was what Muslims did. They gave their bay'ah to the Khalifa, the Ottoman Khalifa. Within over the space of space of maybe 80, 90 years, he became a normal Muslim to being an extremist, and nothing changed in his condition, in his belief, and so on, simply because he believed in the caliphate. So this is the absurdity of it. The second faction of the neoconservatives, it's a bit complicated, but there are many neoconservatives in America and in England, like Douglas Murray, I don't know if you've heard of him, and they believe that you can use fear or an external threat as something useful to unite society in a time where there's no values, because secularism has kind of destroyed a lot of cohesive values. So you can use fear, you can use what they call the noble lie, they call it. They quote Plato's concept on this. Using the noble lie, which is noble because it brings people together, And so so Islam is useful to achieve what the neoconservative perspective. As Christians are another faction, that militant Christians, not the majority of Christians, a fringe group of Christians, believe that use this idea and inflate the idea that Islam is a threat to the West and is coming to kill us, mainly because they have a theological difference with Islam, that we don't believe Jesus is God, and in order to kind of stop the preaching of Islam, they want to kind of throw mud at it to make it look bad, and they just kind of inflate that, yeah, it's evil, don't even pay attention or listen to it, it's coming to destroy you, all good Christians should fight against it, and so on and so forth. Then there are the militant atheist faction, which also uses and inflates the issue of Islam being synonymous with terrorism and concocts it as well, but mainly because it fits their agenda of being anti-religion. And Islam is a useful example. They can say, well, we hate religion. And some people say, why? Well, look at Islam. And then they use that. And Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and all his merry friends have used it and used it to death. And of course, the last faction, which has an agenda in this, has a stake in this, is the nationalists or fascists, as they're called, who believe in a cultural supremacy of whichever country they're from. So English cultural supremacy, Greek cultural supremacy now with an openly fascist group in Greece. And Islam simply is the religion of immigrants, and so it fits very nicely that they could just say, yeah, we hate Islam, avoiding being called racists. So they can say we hate Islam, and they're referring to quote-unquote brown people, as they say. And obviously you see it in their usage. I mean, for example, there's a woman who pushed, I believe, a Hindu man onto the rails in a New York subway, pushed him, and said that, yeah, I hate Muslims and Hindus, and so on and so forth, and they commit terrorism. So in some aspects, they don't even discriminate or differentiate. And people say, but a lot of these fascists, they only hate Islam. They say they don't hate other religions. Well, we know that BNP, for example, have said statements have been construed to be racist, and they had a token Sikh guy. And so that's in the case of using the immigrants against the immigrants, and they're happy to do that themselves. So that's fine for them. So, in all, these are different factions who have a stake, who have an agenda. The government are the most mainstream ones, but there are various different factions. Or I could also say there are extreme left-wing liberals like Geert Wilders, if you pronounce his name properly, and others who basically are extreme liberals who just say that, well, Islam and liberalism are incompatible, which is true, but therefore we must be intolerant of it. Whereas I would say that just because you don't believe in something doesn't mean that you can't coexist with it or live with it peacefully. As Muslims, we coexist peacefully with other religions that had different law systems to us, and we didn't kill them, oppress them, or say they have to integrate into Islamic society or go. We never offered that ultimatum, but unfortunately in the West they're not as tolerant or enlightened as classical Islamic civilization is or was. So in essence, I think bringing all that to a head, I think that to sum it up, the case of a Muslim who commits an act of terrorism is not a case of human nature failing to prevent an atrocity caused by the teachings of Islam. You know, human nature with the natural empathy. So it's not a case of human nature failing to prevent an atrocity caused by the teachings of Islam. Reacting to the circumstances that the person faced. Really, the real case is a Muslim who commits an act of terrorism is a case where the teachings of Islam failed to prevent an atrocity caused by human nature reacting to their circumstances. So it's actually human nature which has caused, which is the cause of terrorism under various circumstances. Many humans across the globe, throughout history, in every religion and belief, have used terrorism or asymmetric warfare or a number of different tactics or means in pursuit of their goals, especially those who are in desperate circumstances and situations. And this is a sad failing of humanity. And if you see a Muslim who commits act of terrorism, that only shows that Islam failed to prevent it in themselves from following their wayward course. And unfortunately, that is the case. And inshallah, we as Muslims should try to foster Islam better amongst the Muslim community and tell our fellow brothers and sisters that yes, it is painful when you see injustice, it is painful when you see innocents being killed, but do not become evil like those who actually commit the evil in the first place, because then you are no different to them. And as Muslims, we are witnesses to mankind for justice, and we do not react as the Prophet Muhammad told us, do not be treacherous to those who are treacherous to you. So even those who are treacherous to you, do not reciprocate by being treacherous to them. And this is a teaching that we can learn from. Thank you. Allah.